Hey everybody, so this is going to be the part 2 where I show you how to take images from both V-Ray and Thea, which I'll cover both in this video, and bring them into Photoshop for final composing. So what you see in front of you is a few adjustments I've made to the standard shadered mode view, which I'm just going to restore defaults so we can see what that process looks like. So one thing we want to get out is the line work. Although we could use the pen mode as an option, I find actually the pen mode is a little slow for whatever reason, and just adjusting the shaded mode works pretty well too. So I'm just going to set the background color to be white, going to set a single color for all objects, and white is fine. Turn everything off other than curves, because we don't need any of that stuff. We just want to see curves. And set the edge thickness to be 1. And all these things are basically just making it so we can see all of our designs on just a white background, just so we see nothing but the lines. So you can see there's still color to things. So if we go to objects, nope, I'm sorry, not objects. Actually, yes, objects. We're gonna go to curves and just change the curve colors to use a single color for all curves. And the same thing for surfaces, because surfaces have edges. So we wanna use just a single color for all edges. And both of them are gonna be black. So we'll end up with an image that looks something like this that we can then do UCapture to file. And we'll want to just make sure that we're around the same resolution or slightly higher than the resolution of the rendering. So 3400 was my recommendation for the width. So for me, 1.8 multiplier got me to just over 3400, which is what you want to do. So hit OK. And then you want to save this, generally speaking, as a TIFF is always a good idea. So save that to your desktop. So in this model, I'm going to show after I did the rendering. So when you're actually ready to render, the things you want to do is you want to switch over from IR to PR, which is going to be production render. This has already been rendered in production render. I'm going to still use the Presto rendering engine because I find it to be the fastest. Although you could use adaptive, not so adaptive, but the unbiased TR if you want more accuracy. For exterior scenes, unbiased TR2 for more accuracy on interior scenes. Those are probably unnecessary for all but the most extreme circumstances, though, as Presto does a pretty nice job. Next, you want to set this number here, which is the sample count per pixel. So for this particular image, I found doing 256 samples was a good number. That got me to a pretty clean image. So if we zoom in here, we can see there's a little bit of variation you see in the surfaces that you call noise. And the higher that number goes, the less noise you'll get. So we could go to a higher number, but I found it for this image, this was fine. Typically, the higher the resolution, oftentimes the lower number of samples you can get because you have so many more pixels. And the lower the resolution, the higher the samples you might need. So it is going to be different for each image. The other thing you want to do is make sure you have channels set up. So for this assignment, make sure you have alpha selected, depth, material ID, and reflections. And then just press the render button, and it should start rendering. Once it's done, and this one took me about 6 minutes to render. It'll be different for your computer, your rendering, all those different factors. You can look at the different channels. So we have color we're looking at now. Now this is alpha, depth, and material ID, and reflections. So each one of these we're going to want to save somewhere on our computer. So the way to do that is just to hit the little floppy disk here and save that image. And then just save them to a particular place on your computer. Save these to a particular place on your computer. Save them as a TIFF file. You'll want to do it for each one of the layers, so you'll have to save out the reflections, the color, alpha, each one of them separately. Generally speaking, the way I tend to do things is save the color first, again, as a TIFF, as I just called it save this image, but name it something that makes sense. And then with each of the other layers, I just put a suffix after it with the same first name, so I can keep them organized. So alpha, what else was there? Alpha, depth, material ID, and reflection. Each of these we're going to bring into Photoshop, as well as that image that we just exported through UCapture to file. And that's all we're going to need from Thea. So I'm going to show you the same thing real quickly in V-Ray, which I will So I have the scene open up. Now this render I restarted, so it's not actually fully finished. It doesn't actually matter. You can save it as is. And for this example, I'm just trying to show you how to save things. So similarly, in V-Ray, we have the same sort of layers, reflection, refraction. Now this is a different scene, and again, I didn't let it finish, so we also have sample rate, which isn't really going to be something we bring into Photoshop. Again, just forgive the fact that it's not completely rendered at this point. I did restart it. But in any case, with V-Ray, there's going to be a floppy disk again. If you hold down, you can do save all images to separate files. And that's going to be the easiest way to do things. Then they just appear as separate files with different suffixes at the end that you can use, bring into Photoshop. And that's it. So I already covered how to get to the rendering process in the V-Ray demo, so that should cover everything. I just forgot to mention how to actually do the saving. So when you pull everything into Photoshop, so I've actually already created a file, and I'm going to show the layers that we have here. So this was one that was created using the Thea process, although it would look essentially exactly the same if I had made the same choices in my V-Ray rendering. They're very similar in the actual output we're going to get. But we have our reflection layer, which is essentially all the reflections in the scene on just black. Now, if we were to set this to a screen type, essentially what it does is everywhere there's a reflection, it just doubled the reflectivity of everything, which is kind of intense. But what we can use is we have this material ID layer, which we can actually use to make selections. So we can use the magic wand tool and say, if I only wanted the pool to be extra reflective, I could just select the pool, or I could select, how about this roof surface here? And because it's a separate material, it'll make a selection. As long as you have continuous turned off on the magic wand tool, you'll be able to make a selection based on that color alone. So we could use that as a alpha channel, or a layer mask for the reflection layer. So you can see here, if we look at the reflectivity, basically it just doubles the reflectivity of these roof surfaces, which is probably more than we want, but it's how you can sort of come in and have granular manipulations of particular materials. So if you wanted to just adjust the reflectivity of one particular material, that's how you can do it. So material ID is really just useful for selecting. There's a depth image, and this is something that we can use to, well, we can do a couple things with it. We can set up depth of field. So if we wanted to have part of the image, say the background, go blurry while the image in the foreground stays in focus, we could set that up. I'll probably show that in a separate video because it's a little extra complicated. Not really too bad, but just to keep this one quick. So I'll cover this in a separate video, really. So the alpha is really just this sort of black and white image that's just the background. It's really helpful just for selecting the background. So I also here have this image, which is an ambient occlusion image. I was going to cover this in an advanced version for both Thea and V-Ray on how to produce this image. Essentially, all it is contact shadows between surfaces. So anytime you have surfaces come together, ambient light can no longer come and hit that surface from 360 degrees because two surfaces are coming together. So in this corner, ambient light can only come from, say, 90 degrees instead of 180 degrees. So you get some small shadows. Renderers themselves don't always account for this light very well. So you can add in ambient occlusion essentially as a multiply layer on top of your rendering. And we can see here, it just adds a little bit of subtle shadowing. Now I have the percentage turned down, but we can see if it's all the way up, it just adds a little bit more detailed shadows to things. And again, I'll show how to do that in each of the renderers in a separate video. Next we have the lines, which I just dragged in and scaled the lines to fit. So one thing you'll find is they don't actually fit perfectly on top. So I'm going to quickly navigate to. So with my lines, I'm just going to do the process again, but just basically drag it in. It'll likely not be perfectly scaled, so you'll have to actually scale it. The easiest way to do that is actually first thing is just turn it to a multiply layer so you can see through it. That essentially sets the opacity based on how black or white the image is. And then I usually just start by scaling it to the height of the image. And usually that gets it pretty close, and then kind of shift it around. And that actually might be it for this guy. Hit enter and see how it looks. When you hit enter, it will finish the process, and it usually cleans up the lines a little bit. So it looks pretty good. Sometimes it's harder to do than others. I don't find that it's best to keep it at 100% opacity. I find it best to actually turn down the opacity to something lighter, something like that. So you get an idea of the detail of those buildings, but we're not sort of being overwhelmed by the line weights. Now in my version, I also went in and used or painted on a layer mask in order to paint out some of the areas like these details here that are kind of just distracting. So you can see they disappear. Next, I added in some clouds, which I did just by taking an image that I found on the internet of the sky. It looks something like this. Overlaid it. I used the selection based on the alpha output that I had earlier as a layer mask, so it just applies behind the buildings. And then because that sky doesn't really fit, I set it to overlay and turn down the opacity so we can get sort of the coloring of the sky that was in the scene, because it's going to be more realistic to the reflections that we see in the pool. We could, if we wanted to, take this same guy and let's do a vertical flip. And I'm going to try to pick up those same reflections in our pool now. So I'm going to delete my layer mask and go back into my also powerful material ID and use that as a layer mask. So now you can see here, essentially I'm able to bring the clouds in and have them reflect, which kind of nice. If you're adding in things like that, it's a nice little technique to bring in extra reflections. So next, I did a little fade out on the sky. That's just sort of personal preference. Just make it go to white a little bit as it goes up. Sometimes it allows you to soften an image when you're incorporating into a white page, so it doesn't have as hard of a crisp of a line. Just some birds that I threw in, some people in their shadows that I desaturated. Just painted on a little bit of tone, although I think it's actually maybe not helping super much. And the last thing, of course, is a layer or adjustment curve, which I think is always a good last tool to do because it adjusts everything below it. And when you're adjusting colors of everything at once, you're helping pull these different images together and make them into a consistent color space. And that's about it. So because I did my rendering at eye level, it's easy to just drag down a guide bar and align it to the center, which will snap to. And then all the eyes of these people will, at least approximately, line up along this line. So not all these people are perfectly aligned, but you can see that they're pretty close, and that deals with some of the natural variation in human height. But that's a technique, so these are all people properly in perspective. Now this works because we're all on the same flat plane. If they were down a flight of stairs or standing on a roof, this technique doesn't exactly work anymore and you have to do something different. But this is a great way to get people to align. And it only works if you're using, 2-point perspective and are at eye level. So that's why it's important to make sure you set your camera to eye level, which 5'6" or 5.5 feet is generally what I do. Okay. So that's it for this little demo. So just try to add some people, make sure you get all the layers added in. For your final output, you want to save this off as a JPEG, as well as include all the different layers as they're just base layers, put them into a single multi-page PDF. So you'll have your alpha channel, your depth channel, your material ID, your reflections, which currently are turned off, but that layer, and then your color layer, and then the final composition as part of it. Okay, so that's going to be it for this one. Again, I'll do some more advanced renderings at a later time that I'll post later in the week that'll cover more advanced techniques in both softwares if you're interested in trying out some different things. All right, that's it. Thanks.